Today I ask you to read little bits and pieces of chapter 11, which talks about choices you can make grammatically to give your writing a distinctive style. The first topic is absolute phrases. We have talked about these before, back when we started with noun phrases, but hopefully they make a lot more sense. We're talking a particular formula. You have a determiner, and remember, you have lots of choices for that. You've got articles, you've got relative pronouns, possessive pronouns, personal pronouns, numbers, a noun headword, and then a modifier, a post-headword modifier, if you will. What distinguishes an absolute phrase is that it looks a lot like a sentence without a be verb in it. It's probably important first to look at the types of modifiers that define absolute phrases. What modifiers? Well, you can have a post-headword participle. Here's an example of an absolute phrase using a participle. It's set off by a comma, as absolute phrases tend to be. She rose, her heart pounding. I can also follow up my headword with a noun phrase. She trembled, her heart an open book. Or I could follow things up with a prepositional phrase. She waited, her heart in her hands. Do you see how in all three cases, what comes after the comma could become a be verb sentence? She rose, period. Her heart was pounding, period. She trembled, semicolon. Her heart was an open book. She waited, comma, because her heart was in her hands. So how do you locate an absolute phrase? A plan designed to succeed very easily can become a plan is designed to succeed. Her heart pounding. Can we add with and make a prepositional phrase out of our absolute phrase? Yes. If we look back to the previous slide, you'll see that we can add with to every single example. She rose with her heart pounding. She trembled with her heart an open book. She waited with her heart in her hands. Why would you use an absolute phrase instead of a prepositional phrase? I really do want you to think about this. This is the question that we're going to open with in class. Here are some reasons that our book highlights. The absolute invariably calls attention to itself. And further, our authors say, quote, it also sends a more subtle message. I have crafted this sentence carefully. I know what I'm doing. Even though a reader may not be able to name, perhaps not even to consciously recognize the absolute phrase, that reader will certainly recognize a writer in control. Aren't these all the sorts of things we want readers to think of us as writers? You see an absolute phrase in creative writing, particularly prose fiction, as our book mentions on page 208, with a pile of examples from authors like Flannery O'Connor, Toni Morrison, and Stephen Crane. Just listen to how this phrase from Song of Solomon sounds. Silently they ambled down 10th Street until they reached a stone bench that jutted from the sidewalk near the curb. They stopped there and sat down, their backs to the eyes of the two men in white smocks who were watching. Does the absolute phrase call attention to itself? Does it add a focusing detail? Does it command your respect? Look at some of the other examples on these 2 pages. Which ones do you like? Which ones could you do without? And of course, I have additional examples for you. It's not that hard to find absolute phrases in the Harry Potter series. On the top, a sentence from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, comma, some of its windows boarded, tiles missing from its roof, and ivy spreading unchecked over its face. This could have been broken into several sentences. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, period. Some of its windows were boarded, period. Tiles were missing from its roof, period. Ivy was spreading unchecked over its face. But the absolute phrase allows J.K. Rowling to create a much more complex sentence with better cohesion, honestly. Second example from Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. A grandfather clock lay splintered at their feet, comma, its face cracked. There you can see your determiner, its, your head word, face, and then your participle, cracked. And then we have a second absolute phrase. Its pendulum lying a little farther away like a dropped sword. Both of these absolute phrases could very easily become complete sentences with a strategically placed be verb. Why not do it that way? Why have this series of absolute phrases in these two sentences rather than a couple of short sentences? This example is from James Joyce's short story Araby, which has been taught in high school, especially English 4. It's about a little boy who's obsessed with his friend Mangan's older sister. Where do you see an absolute phrase? It's right here in the middle. She was waiting for us, comma, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. We have a determiner, a personal pronoun, her. Then we have our head word, figure. Then we have our past participle, defined, and two prepositional phrases, by the light, from the half-open door. This definitely gives us clear imagery. We know that our narrator is looking quite closely at this young lady. But at the end of this excerpt, you'll see that Joyce chose not to use an absolute phrase. He could have said, the dress swung as she moved her body, comma, the soft rope of her hair tossing from side to side. The thing I love about absolute phrases is that they really do illustrate the power of rhetorical grammar and choices. There are several ways that James Joyce could have put together the sentence in which he does use an absolute phrase. Here's what he chose. Her figure defined. I could very easily make this a prepositional phrase. She was waiting for us, with her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Or I can make a compound sentence. She was waiting for us, and her figure was defined by the light from the half-open door. I could make a subordinate clause out of this instead. My possibilities do keep going. What's the difference? Well, Dr. Wakefield, there's one word extra on this one. No. What's the difference in impact on you as the reader? Is there any difference? Does something change about the sentence rhythm? Does something change about the emphasis? Or where your focus is drawn? With all of these examples, you should be in a good position once you walk into class to start discussing why you as a writer would use an absolute phrase instead of a prepositional phrase, a coordinating conjunction, a subordinating conjunction, two separate sentences. Now I want to go over some fancy terminology that relates specifically to coordinate series. These are choices we tend to see in fiction or poetry. First, we have polysyndeton. Poly meaning many, so you have extra conjunctions, one between every member of a coordinate series. There's also asyndeton, and that prefix means not, no. This refers to the case in which you would have no conjunctions in a coordinate series. Polysyndeton from the Hunger Games. There are still nights when game has to be swapped for lard or shoelaces or wool. This series could have been written for lard, shoelaces, or wool. But there's a slight shift in the rhythm and the focus. Everything gets more equal weight. Our second example shows a syndeton, no conjunctions. He lists the disasters, the droughts, the storms, the fires, the encroaching seas. What's the impact on you as a reader or a listener when there's not a conjunction? Usually when we get to that or and, we know we're almost done, right? It comes before the last member of the series. If there's never an and, you get the sense that this is just going to pile up and keep going forever. This sentence actually goes on much longer. There's just a litany of negativity, disasters, droughts, fires. Now, are there professors who would mark this second example incorrect? Yes, most definitely. They would say you need an and in there. You need an or in there. You need some sort of conjunction to signal to your reader that you're ending your series. That's grammatical. Well, guess what? This is rhetorical grammar. You would be doing this for a very specific effect. Another fancy Greek term that has to do with rhetorical effect describes the repetition of sentence or phrase openings. One of the most famous examples of anaphora comes from Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities. How many times do you see "it was the"? Do you get into this very ceremonial, almost sermon-like rhythm? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. We also have some asyndeton here. There's no conjunction breaking up this series. It just keeps going and going and going in these pairs of opposites. Extremely memorable. Probably most of you know it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it's not just in literature that we see these structures. We see them in song lyrics. One day you're here, one day you're there, one day you care. What two rhetorical features does this line from Holy Grail include? You've got the anaphora, this repetition of one day, one day, one day, and you also have a syndeton because there's no conjunction. We see the same thing in the second lyric from We Were Us by Keith Urban featuring Miranda Lambert. Every beat, every line, every word, every single time. We have this repetition of every, and there's a slight change in the last member of the series. We have monosyllabic, one-syllable nouns. Every beat, every line, every word. What you might expect is every time. But our expectation gets disrupted when we get every single time. Pulls focus, draws our attention. Final example is two lines from Lord's Royals. But everybody's like Crystal Maybach, diamonds on your timepiece, jet planes, islands, tigers on a gold leash. What structure is this? Are you starting to realize that although you may never have heard the term asyndeton before, you hear it and see it quite a lot? Another fancy term that you read about in chapter 11 is the ellipsis. Just as you might expect from the ... that you use in your writing, this is where you leave out part of the sentence. But grammatically, it's still implied. We often signal an ellipsis, something missing, with a comma or a semicolon. As our book says on page 218, using ellipsis compacts and controls a sentence. Let's go ahead and look at a few examples beyond what your book provides. I had 2 internships last year while Sharon only landed 1. Does this make perfect sense to you? Probably. What is left out? What's understood or implied? I had 2 internships last year while Sharon only landed 1 internship. The sentence is more controlled, more direct, without that information. Second example, when in doubt, consult your degree plan. What's missing here? When in doubt about your requirements, when in doubt about what classes to take, when in doubt about what you need, we're missing a prepositional phrase here. It's been left out, creating a more powerful, more direct sentence. Now, do you remember elliptical adverbials? They leave things out. What's removed in what you see here in bold? When taking grammar, students experience the euphoria of complex sentence structure. What I have ellipsed is something like they are. When they are taking grammar, it flows more smoothly in the elliptical form. Don't forget about your quiz. Don't forget about all the quizzes we've had in this course. We're almost there. We're almost done. Keep pushing through.